Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I'm Kemper Donovan.
I'm Catherine Broback.
And this week, a special Christmas-themed episode of the podcast.
Happy holidays.
Happy holidays. The Adventure of the Christmas Pudding. So this one was published at several different moments in time. It was first published in the Sketch magazine, as many of these early Christie short stories were, on the 11th of December, 1923. But then it was published in book form in several variations over the next few decades, and seems to have been fleshed out and had various elements added to it over the years, and we'll get to that as we get into the story. So with that in mind, let's jump right in and get to the victim.
There's not exactly a murder victim, although there's a possible murder victim. I mean, the first victim that we encounter is a young prince, and he has a ruby of incredible value, not just from a financial standpoint, but from a cultural standpoint. And he basically has...
And you know what we should say? Sorry to interrupt you, Catherine. We should say that an alternate title of this story, which I personally found confusing as we ourselves were trying to find it, is The Theft of the Royal Ruby. I have no idea why you would want to retitle such an awesome title like The Adventure of the Christmas Pudding. Such a boring title as The Theft of the Royal Ruby. Anyway, just FYI.
Christmas pudding doesn't really describe, in fact, what happens. I mean, it sort of does.
And may confuse American readers, actually. I mean, Christmas pudding is certainly... This is all about the traditional English Christmas, so I have a feeling that in American versions, the Royal Ruby title is more common, just because perhaps Christmas pudding is just a confusing reference.
No, that makes total sense. Poirot is approached by a gentleman named Mr. Jesmond, and we are told by, our omniscient narrator that Poirot has met many Mr. Jesmonds over the years. And so Mr. Jesmond presumably works for the Foreign Office, and he's brought with him a
prince of some it's unspecified foreign land.
Right.
We don't know exactly where he's from.
Implied Middle Eastern of some variety.
Yes, absolutely. It's heavily implied.
Heavily implied, and he's enfianced to a young lady who's apparently very smart and bright and career-minded and went to Cambridge. But, as everybody knows, those are okay girls to marry, but it's totally okay to, have some side floozies in the interim.
He's sowing his wild oats, boys will be boying, kill me now, with the male cliches, etc., etc.
Except, unfortunately, he gives his side floozy a culturally important ruby.
Yes, because the floozy has disappeared with the ruby. They were out. She excused herself to powder her nose, and she disappeared. So the ruby is gone, and this prince is very upset. It apparently, this could have potential political implications, which is why Mr. Jesmond, this vague gentleman spy, has summoned Monsieur Poirot and is begging him to go to an estate
in the English countryside, yeah.
In the English countryside called King's Lacey, and have a traditional old-fashioned Christmas. Because, and it's not really ever specified in the short story exactly what the connection is. Yeah, I mean, we're just sort of supposed to take for granted that there is a connection between the people at this country estate for Christmas and the theft of this ruby, but it is really never specified, correct?
As far as I could tell, and I literally went back and reread the beginning of the story and was like, what, did I just miss a line here where it was, where there was a reason? I mean, they use the English Christmas as a selling point to get Poirot there, and the reality is Poirot doesn't really want to go, in large part because he associates English country estates with being drafty.
Right, with being cold. He doesn't want to be cold. And he actually has a great line where he says that, in my country, Christmas, it is for the children. The New Year, that is what we celebrate, which I just thought was kind of funny because, I mean, he kind of has a point. There does come a time, at least for a lot of families, I know it at least happened in my family, where all the kids grew up and we kind of looked at each other and were like, are we still really going to do this? I mean, it's a much more robust holiday when there are little children around, let's say.
For
So
sure.
I feel Poirot on that.
Right, and like the pomp and circumstance of it sort of seems beneath him at some level. He just really wants warmth. And so the great selling point here is that they have central heating.
Right. Right, that is really the thing that gets him to go. Only that. To me, that, I'm sure, was part of the original story in 1923. So, like, the story begins and feels very much like one of these Christie stories that we've already discussed set in the 20s. So, fine, but, like, we'll get to, it's so bizarre how the time period of this thing just shifts. It was not added to and revised in a fluid manner, let us say, over the years.
No, it was clearly revised piecemeal, although we actually have no idea what the original story was because neither of us could find it. So perhaps all of these perhaps all these inconsistencies are in the original version published in the sketch. We don't know because as far as we could tell, there was no easy access to it for us.
So that is our victim, is the victim of this theft, our young prince. And we could say that there are two other victims as well, and I'll just go through these quickly because these are side plots that will fill out the story. But one of the people who's staying at this country estate, King's Lacey, is Miss Sarah Lacey, who is the granddaughter of the owners of the estate, Colonel and Mrs. Lacey. And she seems like a pretty lovely young woman. However, she lives in Chelsea and is in a hipster flat and is kind of going through a phase where she's gotten in with a bit of a dirty crowd, shall we say. And I mean, they're literally dirty.
She mentioned she doesn't wash her hair.
Yeah, she doesn't wash her hair. And she is very much enamored with Mr. Desmond Lee Wortley, who we are told wears tight jeans and has longish hair.
I just think of this guy as like a really hot hipster guy.
I kind of feel like, newsflash, this might be Catherine's type, everyone. So I feel like you might kind of be into good old Des.
might have.
Let's have a moment of honesty. We make fun of Agatha for having a predilection for a tanned face and a graying temple, but I think Catherine Brobeck has a little bit of a thing for a dirty hipster. She likes a tight denim leg.
I don't like it. You know what? I don't like a tight denim leg. I completely agree with Mrs. Lacey. Is that it really is unflattering for most people. Let's just say that Mr. Desmond Lee Wortley is not looked upon fondly by the rest of the Lacey family.
No, he's not. So there is a side plot in which Poirot is coming to this estate truly under the auspices of Mr. Jesmond, who's, beseeching him to figure out what's going on with this ruby. Mrs. Lacey, the lady of the estate, believes that he's coming to help her somehow wrest her granddaughter away from the clutches of Mr. Dirty Hipster Des. So that's a bit of a side plot. In that way, Sarah Lacey is the victim of both fashion and perhaps predatory young men. There are 3 children in the story, quite unusually for any. I mean, Agatha Christie has a couple of short stories and novels that feature children quite famously. This is one of them.
She also murders them in at least one.
Yes, she does.
So.
Yes, she does. Or features them as murderers. We'll get to that as well. But in this one, there's a lot of cringeworthy dialogue between 3 children, and one of them is named Bridget. She's the girl. They're 2 boys, Colin and Michael and Bridget, and they come up with a plan to play a trick on Monsieur Poirot to pretend that she has been murdered. So she's another quasi sort of victim, seemingly murdered on the cold, cold, snowy morning of Boxing Day, the day after Christmas, stabbed brutally in the snow outside King's Lacey. And we'll get to that side plot in a moment because it does. All of these 2 side plots, of course, in true Christie fashion, dovetail into the main mystery. Shall we get to suspects?
Yeah, there's not really a list of suspects. There's one suspect.
There's one.
And
it's who did it.
Yeah.
There are only 2 people, actually, in the entire country estate who seem in any way suspicious, and those 2 people end up being the 2 people who are involved in the theft of the ruby.
Right, because let's just call him Des. He has come very kindly with his ailing sister, except nobody really sees his ailing sister because she's basically locked in a room upstairs, ailing.
because she's recovering from an operation and he delivers her meals, which I have to say thus far in our rereads of Christie thus far, that is the most clunkily placed clue I think I've ever come across.
That he delivers the meals, and he doesn't deliver. He doesn't deliver all.
Yeah, I mean, if you ever have
also.
a woman who's been mentioned as having come into the house and not leaving her room and having meals delivered to her, obviously she's going to come into play somehow in the story. She's just usually at least a little bit more deft, and usually a lot more deft in terms of how she places those clues in the story.
Right, and so to circle back, we're looking for a suspect who's a woman, right? Like, that's the thing going into this. We're looking for a woman who stole the ruby. So the fact that we go, for whatever reason, to this country estate, and there's a very clearly suspicious dude who's harboring an unseen woman in a room, laying it all a little thick, baby.
Yeah, it's the rare Christie that seems to be more of an excuse for a set piece. That has nothing to do with the mystery. It's really just about Christmas.
And it's charming.
This is actually one of the very few short stories of the early short stories that she mentions specifically in her writings, because the description of the Christmas dinner in this story, and even of the country estate of King's Lacey, is lifted from her own childhood. And she had these rich relations, the Wattses, who had this grand old estate called Abney Hall that she used to go to for Christmas. And it was a very, big, cavernous, full of nooks and crannies, sort of Victorian place. And she would go and essentially just eat and eat and eat. And I think I've mentioned this before, but she talks a lot about what a glutton she was as a child and remained over the course of her life. She just took a lot of joy in eating. These are just the courses that they had. Oyster soup, turbot, which I don't even know what that is, boiled turkey, large roast sirloin of beef, plum pudding, mince pies, trifle full of sixpences, pigs, rings, bachelor buttons, and all the rest. After that, innumerable kinds of dessert. It's one of those things that I'm sure will never be seen again in this generation. Indeed, I doubt nowadays if anyone's digestion would stand it. However, our digestion stood it quite well then. And it's just like, it really does sound like even a step beyond what Americans eat for Thanksgiving, which is saying something because we certainly pack it in on Thanksgiving. But I feel like she just wanted to write a story placing Poirot into this traditional Christmas dinner and holiday time that she kind of cherished. And then the mystery is a bit of an afterthought. And it's fine because it's actually really charming.
I thought it was too. Turbot, by the way, is a fish course.
Oh, is it a type of fish?
Uh-huh, yeah.
Oh, okay.
I thought it was great. Poirot, he is very happy to actually be at a traditional English Christmas.
Yeah, he really is. And the character of Mrs. Lacey is actually
great.
I kind of think
she's great.
Well, she's an unusual character in a Christie story because she's just kind of nice and awesome. And she's like a great hostess. And Poirot legitimately likes her. And she's presented positively. And she's savvy. He just has a great time with her.
She understands what's going on. Sarah is really grateful for Mrs. Lacey. Mrs. Lacey really, maybe she blanched a little that she wanted to live in a dirty apartment in Chelsea and, wear itchy stockings. Mm-hmm. But she didn't stop her from doing it. She was just being, a supportive, kind family member, and she played interference with her husband. Mm-hmm. And that's actually, the weird thing about this story is that the whole, sympathy point in this, I feel, is Mrs. Lacey. You want Poirot to do well, not because of anybody else, but because Mrs. Lacey is just, a good egg.
Yeah. And we should also mention, I thought this was so interesting with the updating of the story, one of the details that really didn't need to be changed, sadly, is that the reason why the Laceys are so close with their granddaughter is that they actually raised her. And it's a detail mentioned that their son died in the war. And obviously that was originally World War I. And then, when this was published in book form in 1960, I'm sure people just assumed it was World War II. I think there's something to be said for Christie's appeal throughout the 20th century. I think you could argue relies in some part on the fact that there was a consistent need for this kind of comfort reading and coziness. People were always in a mid-war or post-war zone from 1920 when she published her first novel through essentially, you could argue the 60s into the 70s when she published her last. And this whole story is such a retreat into a festive and warm and life-sustaining family environment that is not even marred by murder. This is another rare Christie where there is actually no murder that takes place, and it's cozy beyond cozy.
It's also not. This is markedly more conservative in large part because of her obvious disdain for hipsters.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, the Christie sort of conservative politics is totally there, where you can see her disdain for change.
Right.
Maybe Des isn't such a bad guy after all. What's so wrong with having long hair and wearing tight jeans?
Well,
says the man who has long hair and wears tight jeans.
I know. Put all the blame on me earlier for
Yeah, to be fair, I think I could rival Desmond for the long hair and the tightness of pants. So,
my dalliances versus your own proclivities. I don't know. Back to our actual plot. There aren't really so many clues here, which is, I don't know if it's a problem. If you think Christmas stories are warm and cozy and charming, then it's not so much a problem. If you're looking for clues, well, there's kind of not a lot of clues.
I would say the biggest clue is this note that Poirot gets, the biggest, sort of tangible clue. He gets this note on his bed that says, "Don't eat none of the plum pudding, one who wishes you well." And it is really curious that Poirot seems to lack in his deductive powers here, because it was fairly obvious to me, given the poor grammar, and I know to you as well, Catherine, that this is likely from a member of the staff, i.e. the help, who should never be underestimated.
Ever. Not ever.
Not ever. But he doesn't go there, but it is a member of the help in the end who did write this, and in fact, the servant named Annie overheard Hipster Des and his supposed sister, who's been holed up in her room, plotting against Poirot. They're very upset, understandably, to find out that a world-famous detective has, come over for the holidays to the house, and she mistakes what they're saying for an indication that they're planning to poison the pudding. That's really kind of the only tangible clue. There's also Poirot himself has an eye on Des, and because he's watching him so closely, we do find out at the end that he sees that Des has actually put something in his coffee, and Poirot very deftly switches out his coffee for someone else's. And because of this, Poirot is wide awake when someone steals into his room and roots around, including even slipping a hand underneath his pillow, which is really creepy. I don't know if I would have been able to just lie still while someone was slipping a hand underneath my pillow. But so he knows that someone is looking for the ruby. And actually, I guess the biggest clue is that when the pudding is actually being eaten on Christmas Day, Colonel Lacey finds a piece of red glass in his pudding, which Poirot proclaims is just red glass and nothing more. But eventually we do learn that is in fact the ruby that he was sent to find.
I find it a little bit hard to believe that a massive cut ruby would not be recognized as a massive cut ruby.
I think maybe the context of, it's probably covered in gunk and raisins, pudding gunk. And just does anyone really expect to find a ruby? I would more expect to find a piece of glass in my food than
they find money, right? We don't do this in the United States, but I think the U.S. equivalent would be a little bit like king cake, which we have for Mardi Gras. I don't know that we generally have a tendency to put trinkets into our food items other than Cracker Jacks.
Or actually sometimes they're at baby showers, people to do the sex of the baby, where there's there's something blue or something pink in the middle of a cupcake or something like that.
Yeah, I've never had a Christmas pudding.
So basically what we find out at the end is that yes, this indeed was the ruby. Poirot was aware that Dirty Hipster Des had observed him putting the ruby in his pocket. He then observed Dirty Hipster Des trying to
rummage in his room.
And then this is where the child subplot dovetails into the story, because Poirot essentially manipulates the children in sort of a sadistic way and to get his, meet his goals. So the children have very innocently decided that Bridget is going to appear dead. In the short story, there's a big snow on Christmas, so they've created this elaborate tableau where she's lying snow and the crimson blood against the white snow, and it's all very artfully arranged. She has black hair splayed out, and they do footprints that are leading toward her. And one of the children wakes Poirot up. He plays along, and he runs outside, and he essentially then pretends that the girl is in fact dead. We learn that he, of course, happened to overhear the children plotting this, and he went to Bridget, the girl who was going to play dead, and said, I know what would be fun. How about you still pretend to be dead when I get there so that the boys think that you're dead? And also, in case I have anyone check to see if you have a pulse, I'm going to tie a tourniquet on your arm
to cut off
really hard
blood supply,
so that it cuts off your circulation and no one can feel your pulse.
And then he has to make very careful sure later that she's actually gone up to the room to apparently sip some kind of tonic.
Oh, like a tisane, one of his tisanes. I'm like, I think she might need medical attention.
Right. She was lying literally in a snowdrift with a tourniquet cutting off circulation to her arm. For a significant amount of time, I think.
For a significant amount of time. And so for at least minutes, if not up to an hour, it's a little unclear exactly how much time's playing out here, he makes these two boys who are, I think they're like in their early teens, they think that their cousin/friend is dead. Like, they're probably fairly traumatized by this. He's like, oh yeah, Bridget's dead. This girl's actually really dead. I don't know what happened.
He gives a really good game, too, where he's like, yes, it started, I understand, as a prank on me, but alas.
Something went wrong. So he physically abuses the girl and emotionally abuses the boys. Mm-hmm. But what this achieves is that Desmond runs out to see what all the commotion is about, and Poirot encourages him to kneel down and check that Bridget is indeed dead, because what he's also done is secreted the ruby on her, and he knows that Des is going to feel her pulse and think that she's dead, and so this is not a game, and then steal the ruby. What Des does not know is that Poirot has gotten a paste replica, so Des is actually just stealing a paste replica of the ruby and proving his guilt by the way in which he claims to be going to call the police, but runs out. And it is actually a nice sort of moment where it resolves two stories at once, because it both proves his guilt and proves what an awful person he is, meaning that Sarah Lacey is cured of her infatuation with this fool.
And she's just kind of told in a drawing room, like, oh yeah, your garbage boyfriend was actually a garbage jewel thief, and now he ran away and is on the lam in Europe. Merry Christmas!
Yeah. So that's pretty much it. And in the story, this co-conspirator, the woman who was pretending to be his sister, is just left in the lurch, and that is, of course, the woman who had stolen the ruby in the first place from the prince. Des will presumably get his comeuppance. I mean, the true reckoning with Des is that he's now about to go to these criminal sorts of people and try to hawk a paste ruby. He's promised them that he's going to have a real ruby for them, and that is not going to go well for Des, though we don't see that actually happen in the short story. In keeping with these short stories, it's not quite as tidy as that. So that's the story, and again, a lot of it really which is why it's so appropriate to be doing this around Christmas, because the point of the story is clearly the Christmas tableau, which is pretty lovely. And I do have to mention the way that the story ends, which is yet another Christmas tradition. We've kind of hit all of the Christmas traditions except for being caught under the mistletoe and kissed. And believe it or not, Poirot himself succumbs to this tradition, and this is how it happens. Ah, he said to himself, and now I go. There is nothing more to be done here. A pair of arms slipped round his shoulders unexpectedly. If you will stand just under the mistletoe, said Bridget. Hercule Poirot enjoyed it. He enjoyed it very much. He said to himself that he had A Very Good Christmas.
It's
The
really
end. I might have made that a little dirtier
really,
than it's meant to be, but
no, it was exactly how I read it. It was horrible. I was just like, no, don't end like this. Please don't end like this. This is horrible.
So Hercule Poirot, who let's also remind ourselves, was introduced as a retired police detective, so he's at least in his 60s, is kissing a teen under the mistletoe in this grand estate, and that's our final image. That's what we end on. But it's in keeping with the innocence of this. I just think, speaking relatively for Christie, this is such an idyllic and innocent sort of story, and this is very much in keeping with it, where, like, it's this little girl, like, yes, she's a teenager, but she's kind of a teenager in the same way Beth from Little Women is a teenager, i.e. never sexualized. She's expressing her appreciation for Monsieur Poirot. Let's talk quickly about the adaptation. Another episode from series/season 3, adapting the short story. So it's, a bit jauntier in tone, which is very much in keeping with the original tone in this case. And I found it extremely charming and rather faithful to the story as well.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Albeit the incredibly major change in that, like all of the adaptations, it's set in the mid-1930s.
Yeah, so it's set in the mid-1930s, and they made the interesting, and I think ultimately an improvement, to not have the prince just be some random, vaguely Middle Eastern prince, but a real prince in history, which is Prince Farouk, who acceded to the Egyptian throne in 1936, and the story is set presumably right before his father is about to die, and this scandal, it's the exact same scandal, he gives the ruby to this woman, really hurts his chances to have a fully functional government, because there is this nationalistic party, the Waft Party, which is also a totally real political movement that was very powerful in the 30s in Egypt. And if he looks, foolish or too westernized to the populace, the Waft Party has the ability to, wrest some power. And there had been this sort of delicate balancing act that was still going on in the 30s between the Egyptian monarchy, the British government, and the Waft Party. Ultimately, the Waft Party would actually get sort of bounced out of power because they were seen to be as too accommodating to the British government and the monarchy. Right. But this was a totally real scenario, and it just really anchors it, and they make the prince much more of a character. He is pretty awful and outrageous and sort of funny, but like he's
completely insensitive and privileged. Not unlike a lot of real people probably in his position. Poirot is not having it.
He's not having it. I will say this is one of the rare instances in which I think the adaptation in making that change actually ups the discomfort factor, though, of the kind of colonial othering of these characters, because he's very much cast in the sort of comedic, spoiled foreign prince role, which is a very paternalistic kind of a view. I don't think that a Western, certainly a British prince, would be portrayed in exactly the same way. So I was a little uncomfortable with that.
I don't know. Perhaps you could have a British prince who accidentally had a bunch of naked pictures taken in Las Vegas. And
you could. It's just that but I think British princes certainly do that. They're just as indiscreet as Egyptian princes, but I think the portrayal of the Egyptian prince in stories like this tends to wallow in that treatment more than it would for a British prince. It's an easier sort of comedic role to put him into. I don't know. Maybe I'm being overly sensitive about it.
I think you're being overly sensitive, but that said, I think that part of the problem is that the reality of his circumstance, which is serious, is undercut by the fact that Poirot can't take him seriously, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
So while there is a legitimate political situation happening here, and, even if he did something that really legitimately needs to be fixed, the fact of Poirot's disdain and the fact that we are clearly going to side with Poirot always, and the fact that he's portrayed as like this buffoon character, it actually makes his ultimate sort of situation less serious.
I agree with that. There's a bit of a push-pull there that's kind of washing out what they were going for.
Right.
That's true. It's washing out the overall effect in a way that's not helpful. for the story. The one major improvement that the adaptation has in terms of this, though, is that it is not random that he goes to King's Lacey, because Colonel Lacey is a renowned Egyptologist, and because this is a ruby from Egypt, they believe that the ruby is likely to show up there and that the people who actually took it are going to be staying there. So you're at least not scratching your head being like, why are we going to this state, and having to take it for granted the way you are in the short story.
No, it makes much more sense.
Yeah, I mean, and the one change that they also made, which was it's a plot simplification that allows for an elongation of action, is that Poirot does not have the forethought to acquire a paste replica of the ruby to place with Bridget. So when Desmond takes the ruby from Bridget's body, it's the real ruby, meaning that they then have to chase after him and engage in a slow motion 1930s car chase.
As the adaptation has historically enjoyed doing.
Yes, they love their 1930s car chases.
They do, especially through like warehouses.
Yeah, and always with with trucks backing up to block off, one or both of the parties.
I have to assume that it was cheaper for them if they could just secure a warehouse space and a truck that could back up. Then they wouldn't have to do like a long country road chase. They could just do a much shorter warehouse.
They didn't need to have like a village setting or anything. Yeah, right. I'm sure they had one lane that they just went down. Yeah, because
repeatedly we get these one lane country chases with somebody backing up.
Anyway, one thing I wanted to note was the house, which is, I mean, there's a lot made of, for Christie, who often doesn't make a lot of her settings, because I think the setting was important to her and that her childhood Christmases were in this grand Victorian estate. We do get the feeling in the short story that this is a sort of big, rambling kind of country mansion. The adaptation takes it in the other direction, and it's this fantastically modern 1930s.
It's incredible.
It's amazing.
It's beautiful. It's one of those places where like you see it on the screen and you were like, oh my god, location scouts, thank you so much for providing this television pleasure to me. It's like all curved, smooth plaster, streamlined, modern walls. The staircase,
lots of smooth curving.
Oh my
white
god, the
plaster.
Staircase is incredible. The balconies are incredible.
They definitely made a point of, we didn't even mention it, but in Roger Ackroyd, they did the same thing in the adaptation, that it was actually one of the few things that stood out. They had that amazing clock in the hallway that was this like modern clock that was a very minimalist clock, which for then would have been extremely modern and odd looking. And I love when they really amp up the 30s Art Deco styling, both exterior and interior for the houses.
The thing is, it's actually, you kind of take it for granted a lot of times, because Poirot's apartment building is so, at some level, iconic if you watch the series. We don't see it as much in the many, many, many country estates we go to, but this is really a gem in this.
Yeah, it's a particular gem. There's a scene where Poirot teaches the assembled group how to open up a mango and eat it. Oh yeah,
it's like it's kind of a useless waste of like 2 minutes.
No, it's a total waste of 2 minutes. But the odd thing is, I'm actually struck as we're rewatching all of these episodes. I know that I watched all of them, but I rarely remember anything specific, and I 100% remembered that mango scene. And that Poirot, if anyone's going to know how to eat a mango daintily without getting a single bit of juice on him, it's Monsieur Poirot. So.
Yeah, and apparently I read on something that I guess David Suchet actually was the one who suggested that. I don't know if that's true, and I actually can't cite my source.
Who suggested that scene?
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, he was really into adding all those little ticks of character, so that doesn't surprise me. That
I wish I could recall exactly where that was from, but I believe somebody had taught him how to cut a mango exactly like that, and he brought that into the episode.
I mean, I know we talk about in general how what a great performance Suchet does in these, but I had 3 very short moments that to me were just priceless. One is the frown that he makes when he realizes that he's going to have to go to King's Lacey after all, which is a dead ringer for the frown that Kermit the Frog makes as a Muppet. Like when his face goes down. Like I've never seen a human make a more it's the identical frown, and it was just the most adorable thing that I've ever seen. Then when he's sleeping, and I'm not sure if before in the series we've seen Poirot sleeping, but this is the first time in the rewatching that I noticed it. The way that he holds his two little hands
on the covers.
And then the other thing that I loved is during the car chase that we mentioned, he actually lets out an eek, which is...
Don't worry, I've got an idea.
Where is it you are going?
Hold tight.
It couldn't be cuter if a chipmunk had done it. There's always certain elements of adorableness to him, but fittingly, in a story that's adorable, he really ups the adorable factor, and I was into it because I love what Suchet brings to the character.
I agree with that, and I will also just, on that note, also note that it happens in the short story too, but I really loved the attention he devoted to the kitchen staff. We talk about this repeatedly, like, don't underestimate the help and, like, don't underappreciate them, etc. But they have, like, a very pudgy, sort of sad sack of a cook a little bit, who, like, just seems, like, super flattered that anybody's paying her attention in the adaptation. Yeah. And in the short story, she actually is so devoted to Lacey is that she comes back. They can't afford full servants anymore.
Right.
And so she comes back only for the holidays, and it's like a real bummer to her because apparently they're only living in a corner of the house, which is like an actually really interesting point in the short story that's like, passes at a glance, but is interesting.
And by the way, that was based on, I mean, I'm just assuming it is because the Christies had a cook who actually continued to work for them when they couldn't really afford her anymore. And she was essentially one of the family. And they loved her, and she was an amazing cook. And Christie herself goes on a lot of tangents about, and this is a tangent that many people from that era went on. I mean, she was born in 1890. She saw firsthand that sort of servant class of well-trained servant before World War I. And she talks at great length about just the difference in quality of servants.
Right.
Before that time. And the way she puts it, which is actually interesting, is she says they were specialists.
Right.
They had a lot of respect for what they did, and everyone else respected them for what they did because they had specialized knowledge the same way a lawyer or a doctor does.
No,
and that wasn't the case afterward. It was more like, sure, you could be hired for it, but like the cook mentions that they're not trained properly anymore. I mean, this is such a nostalgic story.
If we're going to just be completely honest and say the mystery is like not that good in it, all of the stuff that are the details are really good. And I think the cooking in particular, and Poirot, who I guess by extension is Christie, being so appreciative of the kitchen. And I also thought one of the things that I found was really touching was, I mean, we mentioned it earlier, but the sort of narrative kindness extended to Mrs. Lacey's attempts at being really inclusive and bringing everybody into decorating for Christmas was a weird detail that kind of just passes by. It doesn't really matter to the plot, but I thought it was lovely.
I agree. And I will say this because I think we should have an ongoing competition for the most obscure or at least unlikely references to make between other authors and Agatha Christie. But this story actually reminded me very much of, there's this lovely short story by Truman Capote called A Christmas Memory. In that, most people think of In Cold Blood when they think of Truman Capote or Breakfast at Tiffany's, both of which are very brutal in different ways. It's a very un-Capote-like story, but it is just this really lovely and kind of heartbreaking Christmas memory. I mean, it's a memory of sort of the way it felt to be celebrating Christmas. And I feel like they were doing the same things. I mean, Agatha Christie is a very different writer from Truman Capote, that's for sure.
Don't say.
But it's true because this is such a rare Christie story, and that really was her aim. I mean, yes, there's a mystery there, and like the mystery's fine. It's not great, but she's actually she's doing other things successfully. The story is functioning on other levels in a way that her stories don't normally, and I think that's really interesting.
I think that for a story that was published in December of her big short story year, that was giving the audiences what they wanted, which was Poirot, and providing a warm holiday story, I think it does exactly what it should do.
On that note, I think we should wish everyone a happy holiday season.
Happy holidays. I guess we'll be back after the new year.
But we'll be back in the new year with new episodes. The next novel that we are going to be covering will be The Big Four. And in the meantime, we would love if you contacted us, as always, via email at allaboutthedame@gmail.com or on Twitter at allaboutthedame, on Instagram at allaboutthedame, or you could contact us individually via Twitter at Kemper Donovan or at Brobcat. Have a great holiday, and we will see you in 2017.
We will see you in 2017. Happy New Year.
Bye.